Peter O'Donoghue, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you today Tom Froggatt from Singular. And before we get into the background and everything, Tom, welcome onto the podcast. One of the things that I do is bring on people who are brilliant at generating business through one mechanism. I call it a growth engine. And I know you're great at one thing. What was that one thing, and roughly how much money does that contribute into the business?
Yeah, I think the best thing we've ever done from a revenue generating point of view is start a podcast. And we started a podcast called Careers in Discovery 6 years ago now. I would estimate that sometimes it's hard to say directly exactly how much revenues come from it, but I would estimate over the last 6 years, it's somewhere between a half a million and maybe 1.2 million pounds of revenue has come from no cost.
Fantastic, Todd. Tell us a little bit about Singular then, and why a podcast, and how does that fit with Singular? What does Singular do, and why
Yeah.
did you lean towards podcasting?
Singular is a consulting company. It's a biotech consulting company. So we work with primarily small biotech companies who are developing drugs, research driven companies, and we help them to build really effective cultures. We work with companies on things like employee engagement, leadership development, performance management and alignment, a whole range of different things that lead to high performance culture, essentially. So that's what the business does. And why did we end up with a podcast? Well, I started this business very shortly before I started the podcast. I started the podcast about 6 months into the life of the business. Basically, what had happened was I had been working in the recruitment sector for almost 15 years at that point. I had done a lot of sales and a lot of business development, and I'd learned how to build businesses by just doing cold sales, cold calls, cold emails, that kind of stuff. I got to a point, I think it was probably half term or something. I'd spent 2 straight days making 300 cold calls that nobody was answering. And even the couple of people who did answer didn't want to talk to me. I just sort of thought to myself, this isn't the best use of my time. I need to find different ways to generate business. I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't really want to spend my time speaking to people who don't want to talk to me. It struck me that I bought a lot of things for my business without having been cold called. Clearly, there's a way to generate business without cold calling, without cold emailing. And I thought about the different ways that I'd engaged with those people. One of the things that stood out was there was a company I used who I'd encountered first on a podcast. Their CEO had a podcast that was focused on the recruitment industry that seemed like something that would be a really good way for us to connect with people. And it sort of served a number of different purposes when we got the outline of it together. So Careers in Discovery, essentially we interview leaders in the biotech industry who would be our ideal clients, CEOs, chief scientific officers of biotechs, about their careers and their journey through their career and the things they've learned and all that kind of stuff. So it became really useful content for our candidate audience. It became a really good way for us to connect with people that we want to connect with for an hour to talk about their favorite subject themselves. And then this wasn't something we planned right at the beginning, but one of the knock-on effects of it was that we ended up getting some really high-profile guests, and we became sort of associated with those people in terms of our brand because we were promoting these podcasts with them. I think there was lots of benefits to it. It also became my favorite thing that I did. It was just so interesting to speak to these people about this stuff.
So let me take this back, if that's okay, Tom, without interrupting you. So you're targeting biotechs. Are there a lot of organizations? How did you decide where to go, who to?
Yes, relatively small. So there's probably 2,500 biotech companies in the UK. Not all of those would be relevant to us. So we have quite a specific definition of who we want to work with. I won't go into that because some of it's quite technical, but we basically looked at, okay, in those companies, who are the people who A, are scientists by background, because the majority of our candidate audience are, and B, are in the positions that they might aspire to be in. So we were looking at job titles, CEO, CSO, VP of such and such a thing. Additionally, we tried to identify people who had quite interesting career paths because we thought it'd make for a better conversation. They were quite easy to find. We would look them up on LinkedIn. Some of them we knew already. And then as we spoke to more people, we asked them who else we should speak to, and it kind of grew from there.
It's just interesting there. You're saying people with that would be interesting because of where you started as a business. You almost had two types of clients, I'm guessing. You had the employers, but then you also had a candidate base, which is something that
Yeah,
is relatively unique to your style of business. They heavily interact. So, you know, finding people that were interesting helped pot B over here because this is my future career path. Were you choosing guests possibly on their ability to purchase the solutions that you were maybe offering in downstream, or based more on their interesting background, the interesting nature of their biotech business? How did you decide?
well, we kind of found that the two things tended to overlap, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're going to do something like that, I think you got to be smart about where you're going to spend your time, right? One of the big advantages of doing a podcast is, as I said, you get to spend an hour with someone that you might not get in a room with, talking about something that they're interested in, which is them. So it makes sense, if you're going to do that, to target people who could be potential customers or could refer you to potential customers and that kind of thing. I think making sure they are going to be people who are interesting is also very useful, although you never quite know until they're actually on the podcast. I guess the intention for us was never to have a hit podcast. It was never to have millions of listeners or anything like that. It was to provide some value to a small audience, but also to provide a route for us to start those conversations with people we wanted to engage with. So, yeah, I guess probably as much one as the other, but definitely with an eye on.
Fantastic. So can I look at some of the numbers then? So
Yeah.
over the years, how many people have you interviewed for your podcast?
So it's currently just over 150 episodes we've released.
Wow. And is each interview with a separate company, or have you done multiple interviews for one company?
We've done some where we've had more than one person from the same company. It's tended to be quite far apart, a few years apart. We've actually also recently started to do some repeat guests. So some of the people from the early days of the podcast, now they're 5 years down in their career. But yeah, there's been some duplication of companies, but mostly it's been separate companies.
So out of those 100, how many of those have converted into clients?
Yeah. Well, there was a point when we first started the podcast where it generated about a third of our clients. So it was very, very successful in that. Maybe 50 clients have come from that.
Out of about 150 interviewed.
Yeah.
Amazing. And do you know, have you ever tracked an average period of time after someone interviews to how long it takes to become a client?
It really varies, to be honest. I remember going in to see the CEO of a company. This is when we used to do them in person before COVID. And before we even started the interview, we usually do a short prep call, but because this person was very, very important and very busy, we hadn't done the short prep call. We'd done it with their assistant. So it was the first time I'd spoken with him. And as we were just getting ready for the meeting and getting ready to start, he said, well, tell me a little bit about what your company does, first of all. And I told him, he said, have you spoken to our HR team here? And he said, okay, I will introduce you after this call. After we finished the podcast, he walked me down to the HR department. He said, those things we're recruiting for, you should speak to this guy. So it can be that quick. Whereas there's been others where it's been the start of the conversation that's then gone on for maybe a couple of years before it's converted. So I think we don't try and pressure the conversion of it. And partly that's because our clients are quite high value. So, a client on average is worth about 50 grand a year to us. So sometimes it takes a while to win those clients, but it's definitely a really good way to open that conversation and start that relationship.
Brilliant. So, Tom, it might come out in the podcast. So I've met Tom before, and in fact, at one stage, we even shared an office. So, I know Tom's background. Well, I say shared an office. I lived in Tom's office for a little while, but coming out of the COVID period, so I know a fair amount about what Tom is doing. And the podcasting strategy always shines through. But I always picked up both your sincerity, your professionalism, and not many people, as you're saying, were doing this podcasting. But recently, I saw one of these Facebook ads, new way of winning business, and now someone was pitching, build your client base through podcasting. I won a lot, so I bought it. It was so insincere, the approach. It was, okay, so here's your list, get them on. it's like a 15-minute podcast. At the beginning, you have your canned pitch about, I help people with problem do X, Y, Z, which is not intended for anyone else bar the person you're interviewing. Get through the 15 minutes, close it down, and then almost so you can re-pitch them.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at it thinking, man, if this is what people are doing,
Yeah.
so much opportunity still, because it's just, and I look at it, I think I would prefer to spend 45 minutes, 50 minutes really getting to know someone with no business element naturally assigned to it, and giving them a platform. And that's what I kind of view what you've done brilliantly is, there is no intent necessarily. You've given them a platform to talk about themselves. It just so
Yeah.
happens that it's turned into business.
Yeah, and if you are picking people who are potential customers who are the right profile and you're building a genuine relationship with them, then, some of them will prove that, right? If you then follow up and keep in touch with them and that kind of thing. But yeah, you have to do it genuinely. I agree. No connection really between the podcast conversation and a pitch. I will sometimes say to people at the end, look, if you ever want to talk about people and culture, you know where we are. That's about as high pressure as it gets. And some people we've done a podcast with had a great conversation. They've never spoken to me again because all they wanted to do was do the podcast. That's cool. But yeah, I agree with you. I think if you are starting a podcast, firstly, you've got to do it from a point of view where it's going to provide some value to someone, because that's why you're going to get good people to come on it. One of the reasons we've got great engagement from some high profile people is that our view is that we want the podcast to help people with their career and to help people understand what their career options are and things like that. So it's a way to give back.
So you've got your careers and discovery, and then
Yeah.
the sub main theme within that is helping other people understand their career trajectory. There's still a focal point to what you're talking about.
There are three outcomes that we look for. The first is that we want people, so it's targeted at early career scientists. We want them to understand what their career options are in the biotech sector. They can go and work for a big company like AstraZeneca in the lab, but there's lots of other things they could do. If they do want to be a CEO, for example, or a chief business officer, or whatever it is they might want to do, how other people have done that, what routes have they taken? And then thirdly, we figure those people probably have learned some things along the way. So we'd like to share their career advice with those people. But yeah, there's some clear outcomes that we have.
So tell me, I want to, in a bit, look at the technical side. Could anyone do this? Has the time come where the market's swamped and there's no point doing this at all?
No, I don't think so. I think you have to do it with genuine commitment to actually having a conversation and building a relationship and not just building business, as you've touched on. And I think you've just got to be consistent with it. If you do 10 episodes of a podcast, you're already in the top 90% of podcasts. If you do 20, you're in the top 1% of podcasts, because most people starting don't get loads of business immediate, don't get to the top of the iTunes charts, and then they give them up. So I think you have to be prepared to go the distance with it. And you have to be prepared to see it as a way to build relationships and provide a bit of value to your market, rather than just a transactional, if I do 5 podcasts, I'll get 3 pieces of business. I think there's still a lot of legs in it.
Yeah, and I'm in complete agreement with you on that. And I think more so now because, we're both active on LinkedIn, and, paid advertising's taken a bit of a slaughtering in terms of both effectiveness and brand and trust, and AI with clones of, you can get anyone to do a clone. So I think for senior people, there is a movement towards building their own personal trust in what you do as a podcast, allow senior people to get their place in the content creation ecosphere and build their know, like, and trust.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's a really important personal brand point around this as well, right? Yes, for the people who are the guests, but for you as well. If you listen to a podcast that someone hosts and you listen to a lot of it, you kind of feel like you know that person. And that's really powerful from a personal branding point of view. And I think if you can create those mechanisms for people to get to know you in different ways, then that's really powerful as well.
Perfect. So, Tom, if no one ever listened to your podcast on iTunes and all the other platforms, is it still worth doing for you?
Yes. Yeah. it loses some of its value in that we do actually want to make a difference to people's careers, right? There is a genuine desire to
Yeah.
do that. But yes, it would be because we get the opportunity to open these conversations with people that are just inherently really interesting. They've taught me more about the industry than probably anything else I've done. And it's built my network and my connections loads and has associated my name with these people who, I mean, some of them are the leading names in the biotech sector in the UK and beyond. So yeah, absolutely.
So Tom, you mentioned a word there that I use a lot in my training with my clients, and I very often frame it as the C word, but it's consistency.
Yes.
Like you say, in this element, it's the consistency of, if you do 10, but like everything else, if you're looking at it as a business development or a marketing or a personal branding, it has to be approached with consistency.
Yes.
And around that, I could equally have got you on LinkedIn or, because you are very, is it consistent in what you do? The podcast is one thing, but you build around it. I see you posting probably 3, 4, 5 times a week on LinkedIn and have done consistently over at least 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
So, does all of that consistency and all of that other stuff that you do around it help the podcast?
Well, I think it all comes together to help our business. So I don't know if it helps the podcast. That's a good question, but a difficult one to answer. But I think again, we are some of the things you've already mentioned. Paid advertising is less effective than it has been. The level of trust that people have in brands is less than it has been for a long, long time. So the importance of kind of putting a face. I think it's difficult to be a faceless company these days, right? You sort of need someone to be the front man or woman of your company. Doesn't have to be the CEO. It could be someone else. But personal brand is becoming more and more important. And I'm not saying you can't have a company without a personal brand. I'm just saying it's a really powerful tool to use in the overall marketing toolkit. So I think the content that we create, whether it's video content or whether it's text posts or podcasts or whatever it is, people consume information in different ways and different people consume information in different ways. So the more different formats you have, the better. Who knows what the algorithm actually thinks, right? It changes every 2 minutes anyway. Just make sure it's good quality, like make sure there's some value in the content you create, but put a lot of content out and you're probably more likely to get some decent reaction and gain.
Yeah, you either play the algorithm or I think, what you do brilliantly is you're consistent, and consistency will trump, I don't know, clever
Yeah.
every day of the week.
I think the amount of effort it takes to really nail playing the algorithm is, I don't have the time or the capability to do it. You have to keep such an eye on trends and you have to be so up to date with it. And it's so fleeting that I think just doing things that with value consistently is better because then you can just incrementally improve them as well.
Okay, good. Tom, thank you. So I want one last question before we look at the technical side. Do you ever see a point where you will hand the podcast off to anyone in your team?
I've started to do that already, actually. So I still do some episodes if there's people that I particularly want to speak to or if there's a particular connection there. But one of my team has started to host more of the podcasts and the hubs. So she's been taking over responsibility for that. Partly just because I was becoming a bottleneck for it. And also partly because I'm launching another podcast. So I needed to free up a little bit.
So just how many podcasts do you have now? How many? So you started with one. How long did you run with one before you looked to expand?
Well, so started a couple of podcasts last year. So that was the first time. We'd been running Careers in Discovery for 4 years before we started those two. Neither of those two have really got the traction that I wanted. And because of a couple of changes in strategy in the business, we've actually decided to abandon those two and we're launching a different one. But that's as much because of changes in the business as the podcast themselves. But yeah, we went with one podcast for a good 4 years before we even thought about doing other ones.
And do you think you got exponentially better at it over those 4 years?
But I think, especially the hosting of it, the technical stuff, yes, you can get better at for sure, or you can get someone else to do it. I think the hosting is the thing that you can't really, whoever is the host has to do the hosting, right? That's the thing that will make the podcast or not, because it's the quality of the conversations. It shouldn't be about you. It should be about the guest, but the host has a key role to play in that. And I don't know that's something you can shortcut. I think there is a lot of practice involved in that.
Yeah. Brilliant. So, Tom, when you started it, let's talk a little bit more about the technical side, because you've talked about team a fair bit on the latter stages of things we've discussed. When you started out, was it just you, or did you have a team? You had the idea. How did you go from idea to application and actually implementing it? Did you get consultants? Did you do it all yourself? What was the process?
No, I knew one person who had a podcast, and so I rang them up and asked them how they did it, and then I basically did what they told me.
Imagine my listeners, people listening to this, they're ringing you now for that conversation, plus with 6 years worth of experience. Because, you know, my slight bias here is especially, consultants, they tend to be information consumers and maybe more learning rather than action orientation. And we kind of might procrastinate and take longer than it needs to do this. Is it feasible? Is it feasible for them to go out and do it?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. Like anything, you can do this to different levels, right? Your first podcast did not have to sound like Diary of a CEO. And they probably won't. Because you got to think like you've got to start at a certain level of guests. You've got to start with a certain level of focus. When you're running a niche podcast, which would be my first recommendation, like keep it nice and niche, you don't have to have Hollywood quality production. It's more about the content. You want it to be listenable and you want it to be consumable, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So yes, you can just start it. I think all you need is a microphone or a phone, but we do pretty much all of our podcast episodes over Teams now. So you don't even need that anymore. If you wanted to do them in person, which we used to do before COVID, then you'd need something to record it, obviously. We do all of our editing just on Adobe Audition. You don't need to do a lot of editing for podcasts. We typically cut the beginning of the recording off and cut the end of the recording off, and that's it. But there might be a little bit, you might need to learn a tiny bit about audio engineering, but to be honest, the amount of AI solutions are out there, you can probably pay a little bit of money and there'll be a software that can do it for you. And then there's lots of platforms that you can publish on. So the platform we use now is called Podbean. It's really easy to use. It's really easy to set up. You can get on Canva and design a little graphic and things like that. It really doesn't take much more than that. I think probably the bigger thing is, what's your podcast going to be about? What type of people are you going to have on it? What are you going to ask them that's going to make it interesting? And what are you going to do to get people to listen to it? Those are probably the more challenging things than the technical things.
Oh, so brilliant point. So I kind of had that conversation with you without your knowing, because when I was doing mine, I just looked at what Tom did. So I prepaid my annual license to Podbean for this one. It's like, that's what Tom did. So someone's thinking about it. Key things that I jumped from that, rather than the tech side, was niche. And as we discussed earlier, yes, you could have had a niche biotech, which you did, but you also had a sub theme within your niche. So while it was biotech, you had the careers in discovery, where you were looking at the rise and careers of some of the key people, which was helping balance your two audiences of the senior people who might be buying the services, but also the other side of the clientele that you needed, which were the candidates that were part of your solution.
What was in it for the senior people was really an opportunity to give back. And that was kind of the pitch to them.
Fantastic. So chicken and egg, what comes first? The technical setup, the Podbean and all of that, or the list of potential targets?
Yeah, list of targets, I think, because I guess like any pitch, right? Like anything you're selling, you've got to check that people are going to be interested in it first. So you might have to amend like what the focus of your podcast is or how you're presenting it or that kind of stuff, even just to get guests on to the show. I think, like I said, you can record them over Teams calls and things like that to start with. So you probably don't need any new technology. Yes, you might need a couple of things to publish it, but you don't need to do that immediately. So yeah, I would say the idea of the list, the concept first.
Brilliant. Would you recommend You mentioned there's this magic number that the research shows, say 10 episodes. Would you recommend someone gets a bank, a Kickstarter bank almost of 2, 3, 5, 10 recorded so they can launch with a bit of history there? Or just look, you get one, launch, and get things in traction. What would you suggest?
No, it's a really good point. I would definitely suggest getting some in the bank. And I'd also suggest giving yourself a goal every week of contacting a certain number of people about the podcast. Because you can run out very quickly if you don't do that consistently. So give yourself a bit of breathing room, give yourself a bit of a head start. The amount that you need, it depends on how regularly you're going to put them out and all that kind of stuff. We're up to 2 episodes a week now, but it started out as one every couple of weeks. But there've been times where we ran out of episodes, and then it takes a little while to get it going again. So definitely give yourself a bit of a runway.
So based on your experience, and how many people do you need to contact to end up with one podcast interview?
Yeah, about 10.
10 to 1.
Depending on
Wow.
the level of seniority and that kind of stuff.
I would have thought there'd be high, a better ratio, 1 in 10. I would have thought, so 40, 50% of people would be interested in coming on. So, with your brilliance as well, it's good I think, for people to set that benchmark, that this isn't easy as such. There's work needs to be done here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we're targeting primarily C-level executives and things like that. So it's probably the toughest group to get into. And you'll have occasions where you'll contact 5 people in a row and they'll say yes. What I've also found is that as much as we've tried to balance the gender diversity of the podcast, men say yes more frequently than women do. Weirdly, like, men are happy to come on podcasts and talk about themselves at a greater rate than women are, which is not stereotypical at all. But yeah, about 1 in 10 over the years.
About 1 in 10. So if someone wanted a bank of, say, 5 to launch with, and have a bit of history, we'd be looking at, okay, so they've got to do enough work to at least contact 50 named people with a credible reason why they're reaching out as well. And how do you do that first part, I guess, because there's nothing to show someone. I guess now you can show someone 5, 6 years worth of history. You can say, look, I've got this, I've interviewed, a high profile person, A, B. Has it changed how you contact people? What was the first 3 months like?
Same email terms.
If what might change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, now we do include a link like this. You can have a look at previous episodes here and that kind of stuff. And I think we probably get a slightly greater success rate now, because some people are familiar with the podcast and we ask for referrals and that kind of stuff. When we're connected with people like that, it does increase the success of it. Subject line is, we'd love to invite you on the podcast. And then we tell them, look, this is what the podcast's about. This is why we'd like to talk to you about it. If you've got 15 minutes, I'll be happy to tell you more. That's basically it. Well, I would say I'm going for the because they will see some track record probably.
You would go for people that maybe either have a connection into or an existing relationship with first, that might be more open to coming on, which will build a little bit of the credibility.
Yeah. I remember my temptation early on was to go for all people I didn't know, because that would be better from a business development point of view. And then I realized actually it'd be way easier to get our clients on. And then I started getting clients saying to me, well, why haven't you asked me to come on the podcast? So you want to try and balance that a little bit. So I'd maybe have a proportion of your outreach around it to be to people you already know or are already your clients. And then that will help balance out the new.
Brilliant. So Tom, based on your experience, can you think of some of the main impediments? What's going to stop people? If a boutique consultancy owner, director listening to this is, I like the idea of this. What do you think would get in their way from actually taking action and doing this?
Yeah. Usually it's fear of doing a rubbish podcast. I think, people don't like the sound of their own voice. They might think that they're not qualified to host the podcast or anything like that. I think like any of these initiatives, fear is the thing that probably gets in most people's way. I didn't have any podcast qualifications. And I think just doing it actually is the only way that I learned how to do it. I think the other thing you've touched on already is the consistency that you've got to keep doing it. You might see really quick results, but there's a good chance you won't. And it's going to take a bit of time to gain traction. I listen to your podcast. I'd like to work with you. It's more about the podcast being a route for you to have interesting conversations with people who may then turn into customers. And it's not going to be a magic bullet. You're still going to have to get to know them. You're still going to have to qualify them. You're still going to have to give them good solutions. Like, you still have to give them reasons to work with you. All the other stuff doesn't go away. Just opens that door and makes that conversation a bit warmer.
Yeah. And I think one personally for me as well, my experience is not picking the niche and not saying this is where I want to be the expert. Because, I've done it at my own disadvantage as well. Many times the last couple of years, I've been kind of working a couple of different niches and kind of managing those. Obviously, I watched your podcast and I was aware of them, but just never thought, well, I'm that ingrained in that niche that I want to really be doing this. And who am I? And so I've had all of the fears that you have as well.
I think the niche thing is really important. And what I would also say is try and pick a topic or a niche or a subject area that you're interested in, because otherwise you're not going to want to do it. The podcast has been one of the most interesting parts of my job for years and years and years. And that's one of the things that's kept it going because I've enjoyed doing it. We're launching a new one this year that I'm really excited about. And essentially, it's called From Research to Reality. And it's extending beyond the biotech industry. I'm basically trying to find people to talk to who I can explore with. How do you build a company that takes an idea and turns it into an actual world-changing innovation? And what are the lessons around that? And what are the things that you can repeat to do that over and over again? And I'm really excited to get stuck into that.
Oh, mate, and that's fantastic because that's like a natural expansion now, a progression for you to leverage what you've done. You've grown this entity, this baby that's generating revenue, and now it gives you a platform to move into something slightly different with authority. I love that. I think that's brilliant. Sometimes people want this bigger piece or multiple pieces, but won't do the work on the core first, get the one thing done. And this is something we chatted. Do you think it's wise then, you get this podcast running, you said, it could have contributed between 500,000, 1.2 million. It's very hard to track in terms of revenue for you. Is it enough to just then focus everything in on that?
I think it's a high-risk strategy. And you want as many routes to generating leads as possible while focusing on making each one of them as strong as you can. While I don't think you want 100 strategies, none of which you really execute, if you start with one or two things that really do deliver results, and you might need to try lots of things to find the right ones for your business, then you can, once those are working, keep refining them, but you expand it to 3 or 4, and then you expand that to 7 or 8. And I think over time, the more high quality routes you have to generate leads, the more resilient your business is going to be, right? Because as we've certainly seen this over the last 18 months, I'm sure you have as well. A lot of the stuff we used to do that was effective has stopped being effective. And we got to find different ways to generate leads. But because we had quite a few different ways to do that, it didn't kill our entire business when this method stopped working over here. So I think at first, if you've got a small business or you're just starting out, focus on 2 or 3 things and get them really good. But then, gradually you want to add some legs to that table so that you're not quite as exposed to those things.
So the way you're talking, I'm tempted to ask you questions around, what were those things? What's the word? Well, I'm conscious of time because we could carry on going. So I'm probably looking forward now to the next podcast interview that we do.
Sounds good.
I personally want to say, and this isn't because you're a podcast guest, I've known you for a few years.
Really not out.
I've always looked at you with admiration of your professionalism, your consistency, and the brilliance of what you do. It's something, people think brilliance is innovation and stuff, it's just the dogged determination and consistency to make something work. And I've always admired that of you. You were a one-time client, and I always felt that I didn't really add a lot of value other than just giving you a sounding board to tell me what you're doing. And I say, yeah, I think you're on the right track here. I think you're doing really
Yeah.
well. I don't think I really ever pulled apart anything. So, Tom, for that, as a podcast guest, thank you very much. And I think all of your clients and the people that you engage through your work, I know are much better off through the work that you do with them. So thank you very much for that, Tom. And thank you for coming on the podcast. Last bit over to you is, if people were looking for you, where would they find you?
If you open LinkedIn, you'll probably see my face. So you can find me on there, or our website is www.singular-biotech.com.
Brilliant. And I'll obviously try and put links everywhere that I put this. Thank you.
Cheers, Vic.
You are a superstar.